In today's study we come to Joshua chapter 9, so please open your Bibles there as this will help us to study it together. We noticed in an earlier study that chapters 5:1 to 8:35 are united together as a section, in which the introductory formula about the kings of the Canaanites having heard of Joshua's exploits occurs both in 5:1 to 2 and 9:1 to 2. In the same way that following two chapters are both divided from the immediately surrounding chapters and united in the larger section running from 5:1 to 12:24 by the same words. Indeed, chapter 9 verse 1 and 2 anticipates chapter 10 verses 1 to 43, but in a manner typical of the author of Joshua, tension and expectation are heightened by first including a very different type of story than those which surround it, the submission of the Gibeonites. But why? This is where some detective work is again necessary, and where we need to be careful that we do not become preoccupied with our questions, but listen to the text. Several things are indeed striking. First of all, the Gibeonites, who, as chapter 10 verse 2 notes, were an efficient fighting unit, are contrasted with the other peoples of the neighbourhood. Thus, while the other kings came to make war, the Gibeonites resorted, we're told, to a ruse, so as to establish a treaty with Israel. Secondly, the Gibeonites then make their own confession, one which echoes that of Rahab in chapter 2 and flanks the narrative. Thus, in their initial plea, they say, "We have heard reports of him," that is the Lord, "all that he did in Egypt and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan." We find that in verses 9 and 10. And similarly, they defend themselves with the words, "Your servants were clearly told how the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you the whole land." Now you see that in verse 24. And finally, the Gibeonites are given responsibility to be woodcutters and water carriers in verse 21. But in the aftermath of their second confession, this is further specified as for the community and the altar of the Lord at the place the Lord would choose. Verse 27. There, in a highly dignified role, they remained, never apparently a snare to Israel. Thus, in three separate ways, the Gibeonites seem to be presented in a positive light in this chapter. In contrast, the confederation of Canaanite kings listed in verses 1 and 2 apparently constituted the political power block of southern Canaan, and were probably supported by the Egyptians. They were first mentioned in chapter 5 verse 1 and 2, paralyzed with fear, but here they roused themselves to do something. But action fails to materialize, and the coalition splits with the defection of the Gibeonites. Only this defection spurs them to eventual action, and probably enables them to overcome their mutual hostilities. All in all, this is a pathetic picture of sin and its effects. The rest of the story is fairly self-explanatory, at least at a surface level. Meanwhile, however, we are left with all our questions. For example, were the Gibeonites right to do what they did? Certainly the Israelites disapproved, thus Joshua says, "Why did you deceive us?" in verse 22. But having been conned, Joshua was bound to say this. What then did the author think? Here verse 4 is interesting when it says the Gibeonites resorted to a ruse. The Hebrew word used here has a range of meanings. It's used of the serpent in Genesis chapter 3 verse 1, where it's translated crafty in the NIV. However, it frequently occurs in the book of Proverbs in a positive sense of wise decision making. Could the author intend to be ambiguous? Might he be pointing out that life is often messy, reminding us that sometimes we too need to be wise as serpents? And what about Joshua and the Israelites? Is it significant that they did, quote, "not inquire of the Lord" in verse 14? Might this indicate a failure on Joshua's part, especially in the light of Numbers chapter 27 verse 21? Yet Israel had asked the right questions and applied the obvious tests. We see that in verses 8, 9, 14 and 15. Indeed, the Gibeonites had offered tangible evidence, a realistic report and a spiritual testimony, all of which must have struck a chord. Answers to these questions seem as many as the commentators who've written about them. Certainly the context hints that a mistake took place, but what was it? The passage is variously seen as evidence that no course of conduct can be so clear as to excuse seeking direction from the Lord, that we need to avoid a cocksure attitude that means we fail to detect our subtle enemies, that victory can be turned into defeat through complacency, that when committed we are most vulnerable to deception, that we need both common sense and the Spirit of God, and the neglect of prayer weakens discernment. Perhaps the author leaves his story deliberately vague to invite such reflection. But what is apparently commended is the leader's refusal to take the easy way out when the error is exposed in verses 16 to 21. The fact that, quote, "we have given them our oaths before the Lord," verse 19, was determinative of their conduct. Yet should even this always be so? All of which brings us full circle. The chapter's full of questions, tells a story that leaves lots of messy loose ends, and describes a very human tale full of the frailties associated with sinful humanity. At the same time, it commends the Gibeonites. In fact, the overwhelming message of this chapter is that the Lord is a missionary God. It's not on the basis of race, but of commitment to the Lord that his people are to be defined. Thus Achan and his family are out, while Rahab, her family, and the Gibeonites are in. However they got there, the Gibeonites are clearly regarded as rightfully there before the altar of the Lord. Consequently, there's grace here. Mistakes were made, but amid all the confusion, the Gibeonites did find themselves a privileged place within the community of Israel, and in the service of the Lord, who does not wish any who seek him to perish.